So, I wanted to talk through with you 10 Things by Leslie Petrick. Leslie Petrick is a contemporary writer who's considered part of the postmodern group of writers, but postmodernism really goes from um, after World War II to present day. I think there's a real good chance that in the future, from about the 90s to present, is going to be its own literary period, but it hasn't become that yet. So we'll call it postmodernism. And one thing that is common of postmodern writers is this ability and this willingness to play with the traditional story form. And we see that very much in this particular story because we have basically a list of 10 things. And she tells us from the beginning it's 10 things. And this story doesn't read with your traditional story arc where we get some exposition, we have a rising action, a climax, a falling action, and a resolution. We just don't have all of that here, but there is a lot for us to glean from this particular story. All right, so at the very beginning, if you overlook this line here, you're overlooking something that's very important, which is the idea that these are 10 things that only you know now. Notice that it's referring to the you. Anytime a writer uses the second person, it's as if that you become that character, you the reader. But we also understand in a few moments that you is this person who is grieving. All right, so then we're divided up into our list. Our first list is the idea that he, the husband, had joked that he would die young. And this is one of those things that they share that only she knew. It says he joked that he would die young. You imagine 99 to your 100. Here we understand that it's this relationship, a him and a significant other, right? We also see in this next paragraph where she goes so far to say there was a page to record his exact age in years, months, and days at the funeral home in the book. And you added hours, you even added minutes because you had that information. You were there when he had the heart attack. This is important information because it gives us, right from the beginning, we understand the cause of death, we understand that he died young, and we understand that she is kind of haunted by this. We then have this moment where she says that she's really contemplating this idea of time in this first thing, if you will, where she says that even in the emergency room, she would have begged for 10 more minutes. And she's really understanding the importance of time. And then finally, in this last paragraph of our first thing, if you will, we talk about how, or it talks about how she reacted when he first said this to her and how she always kind of punched his arms. And she says something at the end that's important. She said, but he had said it another day and another and lots of other of days after that. And you punched his shoulder every time because it was bad luck, bad mental energy, because you knew he'd say it again. You knew then that there would always be one more time for everything. And here we see this little glimpse of this idea of taking time for granted. There's always going to be another time until there isn't. And we see that this grieving woman is really struggling with this. She's struggling with the fact that there is no more time. And she's also struggling with the fact that he kind of warned her that there would be no more time. All right, 2. This second one's kind of something that's silly. It says he once compared you to an avocado. And this gives us some information. She goes on to say he was never good at saying what he meant in fancy ways. It's kind of to show kind of this plainness, this authenticity to their relationship. It wasn't flowery. It wasn't superfluous. It was just plain. And he compared her to an avocado. Now, if you aren't aware, an avocado's probably not what you want to compare somebody to. But perhaps it is. And then we get some setting information in this next paragraph. You were sitting on the patio in the backyard. It was the day the dog got loose and ran out onto Route 50, and you found him by the side of the road, 2 legs mangled and blood everywhere. And you pulled off your windbreaker and wrapped the dog in it while your husband stood next to you whispering, oh God, because there was so much blood. He drove to the vet, catching every red light, while you held the dog close and murmured dog secrets in his ear and felt his warm blood soak your clothes. And when the vet said he was sorry that it was too late, you were the one who cupped the dog's head in both hands while he slipped in the needle. And you were the one who remembered to take off the dog's collar, unbuckling it slowly and looping it twice around your wrist. And you were the one whose face the dog tried to lick but couldn't quite reach. We see this other moment where death has affected this woman, and it's this death of this beloved pet. Again, I want to reiterate, the you in the story is speaking, it feels like it's speaking to you as the reader, but it's really this person, this narrator kind of talking to this, to oneself, like the you did this, you did that. This is the woman, all of these things happen to. I think one of the confusing parts about the story is sometimes we want to think the you is the man, but it's really the woman in this relationship. So it's important that we keep that straight. It goes on. So that night out on the patio, the 2 of you were sitting close, thinking about the dog. It was really too cold to be on the patio, but the dog had loved the backyard. Every tree was a personal friend, every squirrel or bird an encroaching enemy. It was just cold enough that you felt him shiver and he felt you shiver, but neither of you suggested going inside just yet. That's when he said, I've decided you're like an avocado. You almost didn't ask why. You were so busy thinking about the dog's tongue trying to reach your face and failing, even when you leaned right down next to his mouth. But then you asked anyway. He looked up at the dark sky. You're sort of tough on the outside, he said. A little intimidating. So we get a little bit more to this metaphor, and that's true of avocados. They are tough on the outside. Something I want to draw your attention to, though, is in this description of why they're sitting outside, even though they're cold, they do it in remembrance of this beloved animal, but it also kind of heightens the pain, if you will. It takes the pain to a whole different level. They're not in a comfortable situation, but they're staying in that uncomfortable situation because of this death of this beloved pet. Now, he goes on, or we go on with this metaphor. Maybe, you said, but you knew he was right. In photos, you always looked as if you didn't want to be there. Lost tourists never asked you for directions, they asked your husband. It was something you had become used to and no longer thought about or wondered why anymore. He continued, but inside you're soft and creamy, luscious, just like a perfectly ripe avocado. That's the part of you I get. And underneath that is the hardest, strongest core of anyone I know. Like how you were today at the vet, like how you are with everyone, an avocado. This gives us some insight into this character because we understand that while she's dealing with this grief, that he sees her with this strength. And maybe the surface is hard to get through, but there's this love and this goodness and this softness about her. But at her core, she is a strong person. And that's an important piece for this particular character because she's dealing with something that's inconceivable in the death of her husband at such a young age. Now let's look at our third thing that we learn. And it's that he once predicted a grand slam at a baseball game. This really gives us some insight into who this couple is, what was important to them. It's just an intimate moment. They were baseball fans. It was the Orioles versus the Red Sox. And we get this history of how important baseball was to the identity of this couple. And if you really get to thinking about this, at this point we've come up with 3 things. He believed he would die young, he compared her to an avocado, and he predicted a grand slam. These things don't really seem super related. Now, we understand that in the first 2, we're really grappling with this idea of death. Once we make it to this third thing, it's kind of an ordinary thing. It's strange that he would, certainly that he would have predicted something so unpredictable, perhaps. But even more so than that, and more important than that, is that this is something that is intimate between them. And that's the point that was made in that first line of the story, which says, these are 10 things that only you know now. And really, what we're meant to take away from this is just how lonesome grief is and how lonely it can be when you lose someone who is so very close to you. And sure, there's other people who know things about her spouse who had intimate relationships with him, like a best friend, a mother. All of those people certainly had similar situations, but what our protagonist, our narrator here is struggling with is that loss of intimacy that she had with him and what they knew about each other together. So I want to start here in this number 3. It says the bases were loaded and Cal Ripken came up to bat. Cal was your favorite player. You'd once seen him pick up a piece of litter that was blowing around the field and tuck it into his back pocket. Something about that impressed you as much as all those consecutive games he played. Again, we get some more insight into who he was as a man, the kind of man who didn't appreciate litter and appreciated people who didn't have to do something about it, doing something about it. What's Cal going to do? He said. You looked at your scorecard. He taught you how to keep score. You liked the organization and had developed a special system. With filled-in diamonds for home runs, a K for a strikeout, and squiggly lines to indicate a pitching change, Cal wasn't batting especially well lately. The beginning of a slump, you thought. Hit into a double play, you said. Cal had hit it into a lot of double plays that season, ended a lot of innings. He shook his head. He's knocking the grand slam, meaning a home run, bringing in all 4 runners. He had never seen one in person before. Cal doesn't have many grand slams, you said. Not to be mean, after all, Cal was your favorite player, but because it was true. You knew Cal's stats, and his grand slam total was 4 at the time. After all those years in the majors. Well, he's getting one now, he said. After Cal fouled twice for 2 strikes, you glanced over at him. It'll come, he said. On the next pitch, Cal whacked the ball all the way across that blue sky. Everyone stood and cheered and screamed and stomped their feet, and he held the radio in his hands and flung his arms around your shoulders and squeezed tight. From the radio by your ear, you heard the echo of everyone cheering, and you thought about a boy alone in the dark listening to that sound. Here we see her thoughts here wandering to this child who's listening on the radio, as we learned that her husband did when he was a child, and she's seeing him likely as you would see someone as a child. They're in such infinite joy, and he's predicted the unpredictable, and it's amazing. And this is a moment in their history as a couple that was amazing, that was out of the ordinary, even though it was at an ordinary event. Our 4th thing here is that we learn he was afraid of bugs, that it is her who actually killed bugs when there were bugs, that it really, we kind of see this little bit of a role reversal here. In the big paragraph in this section, there's been a bug, and he would say, okay, here's the bug, and she'd say, it says, so you'd grab a tissue, the you being her, and squish the bug, maybe letting out a sharp sigh as if you knew you weren't the only one, you aren't the one who should be doing this. We see this role reversal here. This idea that the woman is killing the bug rather than the man, which is typically the case, or at least it's stereotypically the case. Or if it were a big, messy bug like a cricket, you might try to scoop it up and drop it out the window. Sometimes, if you waited too long, the bug, silverfish in particular, would scurry into the crack between the wall and carpet, and you'd imagine it re-emerging in the future, bigger, stronger, braver, meaner. Bugs in the bathtub were easiest because you could run water and wash them down the drain. You learned many different ways to get rid of bugs. This is an important piece here because she's learned all of these ways, which shows just how many bugs she killed, in the name of love, if you will. He never said thank you for killing the bugs. He never said that he was afraid of bugs. You never accused him of being afraid of bugs. This is important because it shows she is unwilling to let his imperfections go. Perhaps he's not the big strong man who's going to kill the bugs. And she doesn't mind that. She understands that maybe there's a role reversal here, but she doesn't use that to belittle him as a man. The 5th thing really goes into their books and how they arranged their books. And what we see is that they keep their books separate from each other on certain shelves. And in the 2nd paragraph, it says, maybe it made sense when you were living together, before you were married. If one of you had to move out, it would be a matter of scooping armloads of books off the shelves rather than sorting through, picking over each volume, having to think. It would allow you to get out fast. Plus, with separate shelves, he could stare at his long, tidy line of hardcovers undisturbed by the scandalous disarray of your used paperbacks. He liked to stare at his books with his head cocked to the right, not necessarily reading the titles, but just staring at the shelf of books, at their length and breadth and bulk. You never knew what he was thinking when he did this. Again, we see this observation she's making of him about how he likes to stare at his books. But we also learned something here, too. She says that he had a tidy line of hardcovers that were undisturbed by her used paperbacks. And this is showing us maybe the different backgrounds they come from. If she's reading used paperbacks, those are less expensive books than hardcover books are. Um, and that shows us maybe that they come from a little bit of different worlds, and that he's had a life a little bit different than she has. He was raised maybe a little bit different. We ultimately see that eventually they decide to get married, and we hear her say again, "You wanted to do the book. You wanted to do the book. You wanted all his and yours and his." I never thought I'd own anything I could pack into a car, he said. You felt so bad you started to cry. Certain only you wanted the house, only you wanted the wedding. Is it so awful, you asked? He reached over some boxes to touch your arms. No, it isn't awful at all, he said. And it turned out that this was what you really wanted. Not the patio, not the built-in shelves next to the fireplace, not the grass in the backyard, but the touch of his hand on your arm. You did the books together, and suddenly something about keeping them separate felt right, as if now you realized that the books would be fine on separate shelves of the same bookcase in the house you'd bought for the life you had. And we see here that they kind of, or our female narrator has this idea of the books being separate symbolized this ability to flee, whereas once she makes the realization, once they have this house, that he's in this for her, it doesn't matter if those books are on the same shelves or not. It took on this symbolic importance that now seems right, that they should, it's fine that they're on separate shelves because they're part of their house where they live together. All right, for number 6, we learn this about the story of him seeing a ghost. It says he once saw a ghost. He was mowing the lawn in the front yard, and you were in the back clipping the honeysuckle that grew over the fence. Your neighbor, an original owner who had bought this house for $3,000 in 1950, wanted to spray kerosene and set the vines on fire, but you said no. You liked the smell of honeysuckle on June 9th. You liked the hummingbirds flitting among the flowers in August. You even liked all the clippings, letting your mind go blank as you wrestled with the vines, cutting and tugging, yanking and twisting and pulling, knowing that whatever you cut would grow back by the end of the summer, that in the end the honeysuckle would always come back, maybe even in your neighborhood, even if your neighbor burned down the vines. This idea of the honeysuckle coming back kind of adds this idea of stability, of promise, of consistency, of being able to count on something. It goes on. It was that time of the early evening when the shadows were long and cool and the dew was rising on the grass, that time when as a barefoot child, you would start getting damp toes. You half heard the lawnmower whining back and forth, and you were thinking ahead to sitting on the patio and watching the fireflies float up out of the long, weedy grass from under the apple tree. Then the lawnmower stopped abruptly. It needed more gas, you thought, or maybe there was a plastic bag in the way. When the silence lingered, you walked around the front yard, curious, and found him leaning up against the car in the driveway, the silent lawnmower in front of him. The streetlight flicked on as you reached him. He held out his arm for a hug, and you felt his sweat tacky against your skin. I saw a ghost, he said. He pushed the hair back from his forehead and blew lightly on it to cool him down. His forehead was pale compared to the rest of his face. Notice that she blows on him, probably like, okay, let's get you cooled down, honey. It was probably her mindset there. He pointed over toward the big maple tree, the one that was so pretty each autumn, but nothing was there. What kind of ghost? You asked. You still had your hand on top of his head, and when you removed it, his hair strayed back where you pushed it. Again, she's kind of checking to, see if he's feeling okay. Like a soldier from the Civil War, he said. He was leaning against the tree, and then he was gone. Confederate or Union, you asked? He looked annoyed, as if you asked the wrong thing, but it seemed a logical question to you. He probably is annoyed here because it seems that she's making light of the situation where he's not, or where she is not. He says, "It was a ghost. I saw a ghost." Did he say anything? "Maybe it was the heat," he said. "Maybe it was a real ghost," you said. "There were Confederate encampments along here." There was silence. A car went by too fast, music spilling from its window. "That tree's big enough to have been there, then." Notice here in this part, even though initially she's like, is it Confederate or Union? She's like feeling his forehead. She's blowing, trying to get some cool air on his face because clearly he's, overheated. She ultimately chooses to say, well, maybe you're right. Of course, he's going to come back and respond, well, this is stupid. But what's really important about number 6 is this last paragraph, I think, where it says, "Now you're the one who cuts the grass. People tell you to hire a service, but you don't. When you're done mowing in the evening, you lean against the car and wait. But all you ever see are fireflies rising from the damp grass where you leave it, long under the maple tree." Notice it says, you lean against the car and wait. She's waiting for a ghost. And it would be easy to say, oh, she's waiting for that Confederate soldier, but we understand that the ghost she's waiting for is that of her dead husband. She wants him to come back. She wants a visit from him. Number 7, in this one, we learned that he sucked the chocolate off of malted milk balls before he ate them. Again, this is one of those kind of idiosyncrasies of a person. One of these kind of crazy things that he does. In the second paragraph, it says, "That's the way he was. He had a special way of doing everything. He developed a method of eating watermelon with a knife, cutting slices so thin the seeds would slither out, and setting aside the juiciest fillet from the middle to eat last. There was an order in which to read the newspaper: sports, business, style, metro, front page. The two of you never left a football or baseball game until the last second had ticked off the clock, regardless of a lopsided score or a 10 below wind chill, or being late to meet someone for dinner. He always carried a pen in his pocket and kept long lists of things to do and places to see on little yellow sticky notes inside his wallet." So we see all of these kind of idiosyncrasies to his nature. Notice that long lists are his thing, and yet we see her employing that in this story. And then it says, "If someone had told you about a person who did all these things, who imposed these rules on himself, you would have thought he was odd, annoying. But you found out piece by piece, like putting together a puzzle, and now you couldn't imagine your husband being any other way." We see that ultimately it's these oddities, these peculiarities, these idiosyncrasies are ultimately what builds to who he is and what she loves about him. All right, let's move on to thing number 8. Here we see, we learn that he hated his job for years. It's the way it started out. He didn't enjoy his job. He hated it for years. And we learn about, kind of where he struggled at work. But more so, we see her desire to help him. In the paragraph that starts, "The conversation never went any further than that." Toward the end of that paragraph, it says, "If only he would talk." She desired him to talk to her. She wanted to help him, and yet she was kind of helpless to be able to help him. We also learn that in the meantime, while he's hating his job, and she's begging him to talk to somebody, and he's saying there's nothing to say, we also see him starting to pick up a new hobby. One night, you woke up and he wasn't next to you. When he didn't come back to bed, you got up and found him downstairs at the kitchen table writing on a yellow legal pad. A tiny moth circled the overhead light. You watched it instead of him. You asked, "Working late?" He shook his head, kept writing, flipped the page over, wrote some more, and finally said, "I'm writing a movie." He might as well have said he was being beheaded in the morning. It was that surprising. See this divergence of character here? We see him, instead of doing what's the logical thing, go to work, make money for the family, for their little family of 2, that he's choosing to pursue a passion in this particular moment. Not that he's not still taking care of his job, but he's finding an outlet somewhere else for him. It says, "The moth flew too close to the light bulb, then dropped onto the table next to him. You leaned in, brushed the dead moth into your cupped hands, threw it in the garbage, and went back to bed. The next day, he told you the plot of the movie. A guy who hates his job goes to baseball camp to relive his childhood fantasies and wins the big game, not by blasting in a home run, but by bunting. It took him months to write the screenplay. He thought he was going to sell it in Hollywood and buy a house with a pool and retire. By the time he realized that wasn't going to happen, it didn't matter because there were changes at his job, new projects that he had developed and was implementing, ideas that made sense, that made people pay attention. It was the same old story. Um, we see here when she says it was the same old story, that basically his dream of writing a screenplay, and it says that, before he realized it wasn't going to happen, maybe that's because it would have been rejected anyway, or perhaps it's because he let go of his dream like so many people do, especially when you have a dream in the arts. If you want to be a writer or an actor or an artist or a dancer or whatever the case may be, it's hard to pursue those types of careers because you have to have another job to support yourself. And we see here that ultimately the husband is getting caught up in those other things because work eventually became fulfilling. All right, number 9. Um, what we learn now is the combination to the lock and the garden shed. 014.5, where you keep the lawnmower, the rake, and the snow shovel, and the garden hose. Um, Here we learn about their garden shed, and again, it's one of these everyday sort of things. She talks about the mice being there. She says in this paragraph that starts now when you open the shed to drag out the lawnmower, you look for some sign of the mice. But he cleaned out the shed in the early spring, swept up all the droppings, hosed away the dust. You think that maybe you thanked him, but maybe not. After he was gone, faced with so much more to do than anyone could imagine, as if the world's to-do list had ended up on your own, you were relieved that cleaning out the shed wasn't on that list. Now you're somehow disappointed that there are no mice, no way to know they were once here. You think they'll be back in the fall, and you know that during the winter you'll keep the shed locked, that you won't look. Then you can think, the mice are there, never checking to see if you're right or wrong. This really kind of begs the question, why does she want the mice to be there? What does it show about her grief? Um, and really, I think a lot of what we're taking away, or we should take away from this, is that those mice coming back um, are kind of representative of him in a way. He's the one who moved them out, but when they come back, it's something familiar to her, and something that allows her to maybe take care of a situation that would be reminiscent of him. And then we have our 10th and final thing, and she certainly waited on number 10 for the biggest one, I think, or the biggest reveal, which is that you cheated on him once. She cheated on him once, barely, not enough to count, not really, but it was with his best friend, the one he'd grown up with, the one with the odd nickname that you never quite understood, the one who met you at the emergency room and cried as hard as you did. It happened in your kitchen at a party one night when you were drinking too much and your husband was drinking even more than you. And even though it was his birthday, you weren't talking to him and he wasn't talking to you, but no one knew this except for his best friend because you both acted how you were supposed to act at a birthday party. You were telling his friend your side of the story, why you were right, and he was agreeing. And the next thing you knew, you were kissing the friend. Not a quick, simple kiss, not an embarrassed kiss, but a real kiss, lingering. It was that sudden. We get this really huge reveal here, that's important because everything up to this point suggests that they kind of had this perfect little marriage. And then we see, but it wasn't. There was this kind of deep secret and something that she's holding some guilt over. And it goes on. You thought about that kiss for a long time afterwards. You remembered every detail, and that, as much as the kiss, was the cheating part, wasn't it? The friend said he wouldn't tell, but he did. You didn't find this out until a couple of weeks after the funeral, when you were talking to him on the phone late one night because neither of you could sleep. There were a lot of long, late nights each time, you thought. There couldn't be a longer night, but it seemed the next one was always longer. Yeah, I told him, the friend said. It seemed like the right thing to do. What did he say, you asked? He broke my nose, the friend said. You remembered the broken nose, the funny story about walking into a ladder. I thought things were pretty much fine between us after that, the friend said, because we were talking and joking again. But now I think there was something different. I can't say what. There was a pause. Then he said, what did he say to you about it? There were so many ways to answer the question, so many lies you could have told this friend, but you picked the easiest. He was furious, absolutely furious. Notice here that she chooses to lie to him, and I think she chooses to lie because the friends come to the conclusion that maybe there's something different, but we'll see here Then you faked a yawn, said you were getting tired and wanted to grab some sleep while you could, but you didn't go to sleep for a long time. Okay, not at all. Because you were trying to remember a time, any time, a minute, a second, anything, when there was something different between you and him. But there was nothing to remember. Nothing. That's how much he loved you. And that's the thing you know most of all. So we get to this end part here where even when she's betrayed him, so much to the point where he breaks his best friend's nose, that he never even lets on that there's anything wrong because he loved her that much. And ultimately she's left with this, that he loved her that much. And it says at the end, and that's the thing you know most of all, that he loved you. And that's how she's dealing with this grief. This story is pretty interesting, and it's a little bit infuriating, I think, for a reader, because it's hard to follow exactly. I talked about this at the beginning. This list is hard to follow. It doesn't have that traditional story arc that we are accustomed to, but there's definitely a story here. And the story is really how this woman is dealing with her grief, and most of how she's dealing with it is in keeping up with the things that are intimate to her in her relationship with her dead husband, and understanding that there were odd things about him, and there were extraordinary things about him, and there were things about him that weren't what people would expect them to be, and that he had a secret desires that went unfulfilled, and that he always expected to die early. But ultimately, even in betrayal, what they had most of all was their love, and that even in that moment of death, she could hang on to that no matter how hard it hurt. If you have any questions about this one, I know this is kind of a hard story to dive through because it doesn't follow that traditional model. Please feel free to reach out to me.